and that is Jane Drake-Brockman. She is director of the Australian Services Roundtable. She's a co-convener of the Global Services Coalition, and as a visiting fellow to the Institute of International Trade, University of Adelaide, she participates in the G20 Trade and Investment Research Network, and she's focusing on digital trade. So Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Hildegunn. Well, just a super quick explanation of what is the Australian Services Roundtable. It's Australia's only dedicated whole of services industry organisation. And with the services industries very fast digitalising and conducting international business, trade, increasingly online, like our coalition partners in the Global Services Coalition, we tend to be the lead domestic voice in advocacy for creation of a new global digital trade framework. There's a lot of industry interest in the WTO JSI on e-commerce, which we in the business community hope to see brought rapidly to successful fruition. And we've been pleased to see global momentum build at the political level in recent period. So we're really interested today in having an update on the state of play, and at the same time thought it was a good idea to also talk right across the stakeholder community, business, academia, think tank, international government organisation, and government representatives to remind ourselves of why we set out 5 years ago as advocates of this negotiation. So I just introduce all of the speakers quickly right now and then turn to them in turn. Gerbera Chu is with the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry. She's a relatively recent arrival in Geneva, so we're delighted to have her on this panel today. She is Singapore's lead on the JSI on e-commerce at the Singapore mission to the WTO. And as you all know, the WTO negotiations on e-commerce are jointly co-convened by Singapore, Japan, and Australia. So we are delighted to have one of the government co-conveners with us today. We also have Dr. Pascal Canais. He's Managing Director of the European Services Forum, which is the peak pan-European Union business organisation representing European services industry in particularly international trade and investment negotiations. And Pascal and I serve together as co-conveners of the Global Services Coalition. And I've recognised in the audience online that another of our fellow co-conveners is participating in the audience. So I recognise John Cook from City UK. We also have Dr. Javier Lopez-Gonzalez, Senior Economist with the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. He leads the OECD work on digital trade. What does that mean? Developing frameworks for the analysis of digital trade, exploring what market access or what he calls market openness might actually mean in the 21st century, looking at different regulatory approaches to cross-border data flows, and identifying the benefits and challenges in digital trade. So extremely valuable empirical research work that has guided a lot of policy thinking. And Hildegunn herself, Dr. Hildegunn Kajvik-Nordas, didn't introduce herself, but she is a senior associate with the Council on Economic Policies and a visiting professor at Örebro University in Sweden. She is also the original architect behind the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index during her time at the OECD. And her research interests now focus increasingly on the digital transformation of services industries, including her favorite topic, because she always chooses the hardest one, which is the adoption of artificial intelligence. So we have an extraordinary array of perspective in this panel, and I'm going to give the floor immediately to Gerbera, for an initial series of comments, about 7 minutes, and we'll then turn to Pascal, Javier, and Hildegun. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the kind introduction and for having me here today. So as mentioned, I'm Jabera from the Singapore Mission in Geneva. I'll give a quick overview and update on the state of play of the GSI on e-commerce. And then I hope that will be useful in laying some ground. I think we have quite a diverse group of participants today. So maybe I can start with a little bit of background just to catch everybody up on the objectives of this GSI. So what the GSI aims to do is really to put together an agreement on areas that are important to facilitating e-commerce. So these include things like electronic payments, paperless trading, e-contracts. I think there have been some drafts of the agreements floating around online that I've seen. So I think that most people already have a good sense for those keeping tabs of what these areas cover. The objective here really is to help to establish a baseline set of rules to bridge certain regulatory differences and establish common standards across markets. Because at the end of the day, I think the key outcome for these agreements is to make it easier for businesses to transact across borders, right? Especially with digital trade, because cross-border is really where the value addedness of this lies. And this is also based on consultations we've had with industry, right? Before, like during the scoping process, during negotiations, on what the concerns are and what they'd like to see. And what we've heard from a lot of SMEs or smaller companies is that it is quite difficult to navigate differing regulatory systems, right? And when we have more and more fragmentation across markets, it adds to the costs and time needed for them to try and break into these markets or conduct businesses the operations overseas. So with the GSI, when we put forth, say, a common set of baseline rules, right, it will be quite commercially valuable for companies from the angle. So just to give you an idea of some key features of the GSI, so we currently have 91 members. Our most recent participant is Cabo Verde, who joined in the second half of June. So we're very happy to welcome them, right? We continue to welcome members to join the GSI discussions at this stage. And this is what this agreement would look like as we call it a package of digital trade rules, right? That would address certain interests of members, businesses, and also consumers. So for example, on consumers, we do have certain provisions on consumer protection, right? That governments would have to maintain or adopt measures that would prevent the spread of fraudulent or deceptive commercial information activities, right? This is really looking at preventing potential harm to consumers engaged in online shopping. Because I think for the layperson, when we talk about digital trade and e-commerce, it's really about buying things online from overseas sellers and that. So that's really where most of the interaction for them comes from. So this is definitely an area that's important for us to address. For businesses, I think I mentioned earlier, they will be able to treat more seamlessly. So across borders, so things like recognition of e-contracts is a very important thing for businesses to transact with trust across borders, especially when you maybe have not met your partners before, right? Or you're dealing with certain banks and whatnot that you don't have that kind of face time with. It's very important to have this kind of documents that are recognized so that everyone knows that, okay, what the standard is and what a formal document that is legitimate looks like. For governments, well, I think if you look at the very broad-based membership in the GSI, we have members at different stages of developing their regulatory policies. So the GSI, with its pretty wide coverage, would help to shape certain domestic discussions or certain directions of where these policies are, how these policies are developed. I think at the domestic level, then this would contribute to how they consider or conceptualize certain regulatory developments. And then it will also help to shape this global conversation on what the digital trade norms and common standards look like. Because, I mean, even with the increase in digital trade in the past few years, especially during the pandemic and then following after, it didn't really slow down. there's still very much a gap in terms of the international kind of rules that we have, that we're trying to fill with the JSI on e-commerce. So hopefully this will help. This will be an important step in getting us there. Okay, so on the state of play, I think in April we did announce the last technical round of negotiations. So actually what this meant was that, after 5 years of negotiations, delegations in Geneva, as well as capitals that have been visiting for almost monthly negotiations, have really expended their best efforts in trying to get to landing zones on a lot of the key issues. And following that is really the last stretch of negotiations where certain decisions will have to be made at a higher level, or with more intense discussion with specific members on certain issues that they have concerns with, that might not be able to be fully resolved in the technical negotiation setting, right? And we are still in that phase as of now. So that was what, two and a half months ago. And then we are now still in this final stretch, because I think we recognize that, speaking from a co-convener point of view, we recognize that, this was a very pretty long drawn set of negotiations. And finally, when you have clearer package of rules, then only can the members consider it in its entirety, because in technical negotiations you drill down to every article and individual provisions. And now when you zoom out to get a bird's eye view of like what the full package looks like, members will also need time to consult and digest and understand what this really means for them before we can lock it in. So on the earlier comment on concluding in the next couple of days, I'm not sure we're there yet, but definitely timely conclusion is something that we have strong support on within the membership, right? Everyone's really trying to get there in a expeditious manner, right? And we do see a lot of flexibility from the members and positive, very constructive exchanges in the past few months, especially following the technical negotiations. The close of the technical negotiations, I think everyone's really trying to get it across the finish line. And as a co-convener, I think we're very heartened to see that, right? Because it's been a long time coming. And I think everyone shares that kind of hopefulness that we can close the negotiations. Yes, so I don't want to belabor this preliminary sharing, but this is broadly an overview of where the JSI negotiations are now and what the agreement would roughly look like. And then if we have more questions later from participants, happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being so frank with us. We're remarkably lucky to have you with us. I mean, Singapore has, I think Singapore is probably right up there as the most digitalized economies of the world, and you have been paving the way, including in your regional and bilateral efforts to build digital trade governance. So it's fantastic to see Singapore playing such a strong role in getting something to happen at the multilateral level, at the global level. So I just would say one very quick thing. These negotiations have been going on for 5 years, a long time, as you've noted. And during that time, of course, we have plenty of empirical evidence now to show that barriers to digital trade have continued to grow through that period. In fact, over the last 10 years, the OECD says they're up 25%. So I guess for the 5 years before the negotiations took place, we knew things were getting worse and it was time to negotiate. But another 5 years later, it's worse again. So you can understand, I think, why the business community is keen and wishes you all the best of luck in coming weeks. So I'll just turn straight away to Pascal.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together. I think it's an important event. And thank you to Jabera for the update, and through her to all the co-conveners and the negotiators which have been working hard since already 5 years, as you just mentioned, Jane. I think it is a very important. I mean, I'm from the European Services Forum, which is representing the interests of the European services industries all across the sectors in international trade and investment, international negotiations, and for us, clearly these negotiations are absolutely crucial because we want to support. We have supported the talks from the beginning, and we want to be sure that it will go, as this title of the seminar is saying, through the finish line. We are living through kind of the TISA syndrome, as they call it. In 2016, we've got 5 years of work of negotiation, trading services negotiations, which have been lost after a political decision, and we hope this is not going to happen again. So we are very much supporting these negotiations. As Jabera said, for business, it is absolutely crucial to have at least the first set of global rules on international commerce for digital trade, and the negotiation which have been going there. She mentioned some issues which are very important for the business: e-authentication, e-signature, the e-contracts, as she mentioned, paperless trading. You know, all of those millions of packages going through the different countries through the DHL or Amazon of this world. E-payment, how can you do international business now without e-payment? Different things like transparency of the rules, cybersecurity, personal data protection, consumer trust, spam, all of that is into the package which is now on the table, and we hope to go further. One very important aspect which she didn't mention, but for us is part of why this package is commercially meaningful, is the moratorium on custom duties on electronic transmissions. It has been put down to 5 years for review, but we consider this is a very important package, a very important decision to the package. So for us, it's a very important way to be sure that we will not have tariff on digital transactions, and that will be really a major problem as the OECD is running this STRI, so the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, and one of them is a Digital Services Trade Index. We know that there are increasing countries raising barriers on digital trade, so that's the reason why we need rules. And as Jabera said, I think it's also very important to understand why companies need this. Companies need this because we need to know what we can do and what we cannot do. But when you are doing international trade, you can have a conflict of law between a legislation in a country where you're importing from, and then another one where you're exporting from. So that's the reason why we need these first set of rules. Of course, it could be better. We know that some issues have been put on the side for a while. Cross-border data flow, data localization issues, code source. I think that's what we're really regretting it, and it would have been increasing this meaning importance of this agreement. But that's the reason why also there is a possibility to have a review clause into the agreement. So when the time will be right, we will be able to come back again at the table. And I think that's something we were also very much supporting. But we have been able to manage to have the extension of the moratorium on custom duties in Abu Dhabi for the MC13. A very important group of 211 associations have been from all over the world asking government in the WTO to extend it. It is now done for 2 years. We don't know what will be happening after. We are still believing that it is possible to get it after in MC14, but the plan B, if you wish, is actually the negotiation on digital trade, so the GSR on e-commerce. That's the reason why we want to bring it to the end, because we want to have these rules. And how to implement this GSI? This is going to be the next question. We need to finish it. We need to put it on a side so that it will not be dismantled and eventually put in a bin. This is my TISA syndrome. And we want to be sure that we have this set of rules going to be in existence first, then hoping the maximum number of countries, 91 countries are now around the table. Maybe others will join. Will some decide to wait for a bit? that would be the total freedom, of course, but this is an open process, and the whole concept of the plurilateral negotiation in WTO, which have been launched or decided through the MC12 or 11 in Buenos Aires, the essence is all the countries of the willing go ahead and cannot be stopped by those who prefer not to be willing to go into that direction, but at least there is no veto right. So we want to have the maximum countries signing this, and we want to be sure that it will be transformed into the core of the WTO law. How will this happen? I don't know whether Jabera will be able to tell us a bit more. If we have to wait and transform it into an Annex 4 in the WTO, that would be the next phase, but at least we have a text which is there and it's not going to be dismantled. So for us, it is the absolute priority. And maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. Well, I want to just put you on notice, if I can, when we come back to you shortly. I'm hoping that you might also respond to Jabera's remarks about MSMEs in particular, because I've had a look at who is participating today, and there are a lot of representatives from developing countries, and I just would recognize in particular the convener of the Asia Pacific Services Coalition is online with us, Patrick Chua, from sitting there in Manila. And the MSME concern is probably the highest one for him. And I want to make sure that all the speakers do come back to Jabera's points about that if I can. But meanwhile, I'll hand straight to Javier for his 7-minute opening. Thank you.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm just going to share a few slides that I've prepared. I hope you can see them. So what I want to do is maybe take a step back and provide some of the evidence that underscores the importance of the JSI. And maybe the first thing to highlight is that digital trade matters. Now, from our analysis, we know that it represents about 25% of global trade and that it is growing faster than non-digital trade. But particularly for some countries, it represents a very significant share of their exports. For the UK, it's something like 55%, and Jane just mentioned the Philippines. It's about a third of exports of the Philippines, or even a third of exports of countries like India. So really, really important chunk. And this, of course, involves a lot of SMEs that are contributing to this sort of big numbers on digital trade. The other thing I want to highlight, and it's sort of been mentioned already by the speakers, it's something that we underscore in the Digital Trade for Development report that we did with the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, and UNCTAD, is that digitally deliverable services are the fastest growing segment in international trade at about 8% per year. And just to put that into perspective, that is nearly twice the speed of goods trade. So where are the new opportunities being generated in the global economy? Largely in the context of digital trade. But as has also been foreshadowed by some of the speakers, our analysis shows that barriers to digital trade, but also services that underpin digital networks, have been growing. So our digital STRI has been mentioned. This is a measure that captures cross-cutting barriers across over 100 countries from 2014 to 2024. Now there we have seen a big increase of about 25% in this time. A lot of this are issues related to cross-border data flows or data localization. And of course, really, really important, but the measures are going up, but not just on these sort of cross-sectional barriers. We're also seeing growth in measures affecting computer services, commercial banking, or telecommunications, all of which are sectors that are really important for the digital transformation in terms of getting us to connect to the internet and allowing us access to the inputs that allow us to operate in the internet. And so what we're seeing, and I like this picture, this is something that my colleague Janos Ferenc always presents, is that we're seeing a very fragmented digital trade landscape. So this is a snapshot of 2022 in the DSTRI. And what you can just see, it's just ordered by alphabetical order. What you can just see is just ups and downs, ups and downs. And this is the environment that Pascal was referring to. Now, I'm a trader and I want to trade in different markets. I'm seeing this environment. If I want to trade in Argentina, I've got a whole set of barriers. If I want to trade, I don't know, in Turkey, I've got another set of barriers that I have in Spain. And these are the issues that firms really struggle with. And so this is why international cooperation on digital trade is important. And I want to highlight 3 important areas where progress has been made. Now, from our analysis, we've seen that digital trade provisions in trade agreements have been growing. I say our analysis, but this is on the back of the excellent work of the people at Lucerne University and the TAPES database. What we've seen is that since the year 2000, nearly 1 in 2 FTAs have a digital trade chapter. And so what our empirical evidence suggests is that actually the presence of this can actually double the effects of trade agreements. So digital trade provisions in trade agreements matter quantitatively. We've also seen the growth of digital economy agreements, which include important cooperation efforts on more complex issues, artificial intelligence, digital identities, and other such. But also discussions at the WTO in the e-commerce JSI, which are nearly finished. And so the question we pose ourselves is, how do these contribute to overall digital trade integration and openness? And so we've been working on an indicator, which is still work in progress, which we're calling the Indigo. And so what this indicator suggests is that there has been important progress on digital trade issues. This indicator tracks distance to what we might call full digital trade integration and openness. And what is particularly interesting about the indicator from our perspective is that, it looks at things together. So for example, when we have a provision in a trade agreement of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions, but we also have the moratorium, we don't double count. We basically look at that as one, and we understand the overall environment in which digital trade is operating. And so this measure gives us a distance towards this full integration and openness, and it shows us that integration is growing, but that this is largely being achieved through WTO discussions. So the telecoms reference paper is something that's very important. The e-commerce moratorium, the information technology agreement, the trade facilitation agreement. Actually, it turns out that all those trade agreements that we are seeing add only about 11% of existing digital trade openness. They are quantitatively important for the countries that sign them. They are perhaps not as widespread as we would wish them to be to contribute more to global digital openness. So using this indicator, which I repeat is still work in progress, we find that a successful completion of the WTO JSI discussions would significantly increase current digital trade openness. That is, and again, tentative numbers suggest that it would add around 30% to existing digital trade openness. And what you see on the right-hand side of my slide is what this looks like for individual countries. And we spoke earlier about the prowess of Singapore in this area, and our indicator captures Singapore as the country which has the most current digital trade integration, but it shows also that signing the JSI, which is the dot over here, would add to Singapore's digital trade integration significantly, because it would include more countries that Singapore doesn't have a trade agreement with on issues maybe as well that Singapore doesn't discuss in its trade agreements, although it has quite extensive discussions. Let me summarize all of this. Efforts to increase integration and openness are important. We have seen that FTAs have significantly contributed to digital trade integration and openness, but they tend to involve few and largely developed countries. Indeed, one of the things that we highlight in our digital trade for development reports was that no low-income countries are currently participating in RTAs with digital trade provisions. The WTO JSI would significantly expand global digital trade integration and openness. It would add more countries and more issues, potentially leading to strong trade impact if our empirical analysis on the impact of FTAs and digital trade chapters are something to go by. So this is why at the OECD we think this is overall a very good thing and a very, very important thing to include more countries into the discussions and to reap those benefits that are on offer. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier, very much. Well, I just a couple of comments that you might like to think about when I give you the floor again. It seems to me that regulatory fragmentation that you showed us, which is getting worse, is really the bottom line, the problem for MSMEs in particular, because that fragmentation has got to the point where it's become a trade barrier in itself. And for many exporters, a binding constraint on doing international business. Why? Because it adds to the cost of doing business, the trade cost, if you like, or the regulatory compliance cost, if you like, but that is effectively prohibitive for most SMEs. And we're definitely seeing in Australia, we saw early on a very big growth spurt in our digitally delivered trade, but it then plateaued very quickly. And the anecdotal evidence is telling us that the regulatory fragmentation in our region, where our SMEs are focused, has got to the point where that regulatory fragmentation is the problem, is a binding constraint because of the cost of doing business. So I think in a way that slide of yours, that very technical point you made, gets to the heart of the problem for small firms, which is something, as you know, I want us to come back to. But also, I think you had a new data point there that I hadn't seen before, and you skipped over it, your second last slide. I mean, that was quite something. I think you said that the JSI will deliver a 30% improvement in digital trade openness. Wow. Well, every single time we ever invite you to speak, we get a new data point worth writing to our ministers about. So thank you very much. But I think we have one big takeaway already from this discussion. 30% increase is would be remarkable. I can't think of an industry that wouldn't want that. But I'll move to Hildegun, and we can come back to some of those issues maybe. Over to you, Hildegun, 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I'm just sharing my screen and quickly. So yes. So this shows us that the digital transformation of services trade is taking place big time. And it's basically the same chart as you just saw from Javier, with a bit of a different color codes and these kind of things. But there are a couple of interesting points to take away from this chart. And one is that digitally deliverable services over the past 15 years or so have been growing faster than services trade in general. So the share of digitally delivered or deliverable services have been increasing steadily. And what we also see as a very interesting observation here is that while all trade, including services trade, dipped during the COVID pandemic, digital services did not. So it's much more resilient than services and goods trade in general. What is also interesting here is that it also illustrates a gap in our knowledge, because we see digitally deliverable, and that's defined as a certain set of sectors. For instance, the obvious ones, which is telecommunication and computer and information services, but also other business services. And what we don't know is which or how much of this is actually delivered digitally, and that we do not really know. So indicator of what is actually delivered digitally is the international bandwidth use. Because if you deliver a service digitally, you need basically electronic networks. And I think these are really interesting graphs showing how this has developed over the past 5 years. The data is from telegeography, and to the left here, you see a graph with terabytes per second on the left-hand vertical axis, and the bars to show you the development over time. And it's huge. And if we have gone back, say, 10 years, we would have seen an exponential growth. So what we see with the line here, which is recorded on the right-hand axis, is the growth rate of international bandwidth use. And you see that it has been slowing over the past 5 years. It's still very high. So it was 50% per year in 2019, and 2023, it was 25%. Whether we should worry about this or not, that's not completely clear, because of course 25% growth is still very much, and this is maturing to some extent, but it is a question mark whether actually the barriers that Javier just talked about could be behind some of this slowdown in growth. So that's one point. And the graph to the right is, I think, fascinating. So what we see here is compound annual growth between 2019 and 2023, broken down to regions. And it's also broken down on content providers versus others. And I'll come back to that breakdown in a minute, but let's have a look at the regional or geographical distribution. And here what we see is tremendous growth in the Middle East and Africa. And it is, of course, from a low base, but what we see is really that the digital transformation is taking off in these developing regions. And for this to continue, it's super important that these countries have access to compute resources and to fast and high quality and reasonably priced networks. So what this tells me is really that developing countries like Africa and the Middle East have a huge stake in the GSI on e-commerce, because you really, really need this rules-based system to continue this growth. Otherwise, it can be you can see it level off, and you will see it meeting these barriers that will prevent it from going forward. So really, really important stake for Africa and the Middle East. And also not least seen against the backdrop of the African continental free trade area, where there is the development of a digital chapter, which could easily align with the GSI on e-commerce. So I think these are really important points. So if we look at the breakdown between content providers and others, and here others are mainly the internet backbone services, and the content providers are not so much the ones that we saw the previous graph of, say, other business services, is really big tech. So big tech and the content providers account for about 70% of international bandwidth use, and it has been rising over the past 5 years. And actually, Netflix alone account for 15% of internet traffic. So it's really the big platforms that account for this content providers. And I think it's an important observation also when we look at the regulatory framework and the rules-based international framework, that we need to better understand the relationship between the big content providers and the telcos. For instance, when we think about the reference paper on telecoms and how that is kind of future-proof. And I would say that the introduction of artificial intelligence into this space further blurs the distinction between the backbone providers and the content providers. So this is something that we really need to think about. So to just wrap up and have a look at what implications this might have, I think the point that Jane brought on digital fragmentation is, or regulatory fragmentation, is really an important one. And we are also at kind of a sweet spot at this time because nobody really has a solution on how to best regulate this space, particularly when we think about the digital transformation, how to protect privacy, how to protect the cybersecurity, and how to do this in the context of artificial intelligence. So while everybody is seeking for a good solution to this, it's a unique opportunity to find solutions together rather than to run off in all directions and then have to make it consistent and coherent and interoperable later on, further down the line. So it's really important and a sweet spot now to get it right from the start. Thank you.
A huge thank you, Hildegunn. Well, you've introduced some new issues there, and I'm glad to see you didn't use the word standards, but I think you were referring to the need to get some international digital standards in place, and to see a WTO agreement actually take us forward on areas that have been outside trade negotiation largely. And dealt with elsewhere, but to see the WTO grapple with and accept the fact that much has to be done in terms of regulatory cooperation, much has to be done in terms of international standards development and adoption. But I want to ask you a question that you can come back to, perhaps. Why? What does this mean? We're not sure how worried we are about the decline in increase in bandwidth, but it seems to me that if one was really interested in digital industrial policy, which many countries are, it seems to me that the digital infrastructure building remains the single most important thing to focus on, perhaps digital skills as well. But we've seen a bit of a shift in thinking that in a protectionist direction, that it's about barriers that need to be in place. Whereas I think you're suggesting to us that we still need more internet bandwidth out there. I'd like your perspective on that, if you can. But some of those regional figures you were showing were very interesting. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to give 3 minutes to Gerbera, if she doesn't mind, to sort of absorb everything she's heard from the other panelists and make any comments she'd like to. Some of them may be more relevant to you in the negotiations themselves. Some might provide insights. Some might be problems you've already solved. So I'm keen to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to, I am still absorbing, but I'll try to take it as I go. And if there's anything you want me to comment on, let me know. I think maybe I'll start with a Pascal's sharing earlier, I think you did mention customs duties, which I didn't mention in my remarks. Yes, I think there is a lot of interest around the customs duties outcome, because so far it's really been, prior to the GSI, it's really been at the MC, quite a MC issue, right? That we've seen the extension of the moratorium go like in every 2 years, that kind of renewal. And in the GSI, as you would know, what we are working towards is a more enduring form of customs duties commitment. But I don't want to give, I won't be able to go into much detail, right, about what the outcome is, because this is also respecting that members are still consulting on the possible landing zone that we have. Although you did reference the text that has been going around, so I bit of an open secret, right, where what the direction is, right, of these discussions. I will have to say that on this specific article on customs duties, actually a lot of our members had very intensive discussions, as you would expect, right? This is obviously one of the key pillars of the agreement. And I would say that everyone is really trying to be as constructive as possible on this provision, to try and find a formulation that works for everybody, right? I think for the GSI in general, like most trade agreements, the more members you have, the harder it is to strike a balance and to take everyone's interest into account, right? So that the outcome that we would eventually achieve might not be the perfect situation for everybody, right? But it is a valuable product of a lot of accommodation and a lot of understanding of what each party views this commitment as, and also whether they are able to implement this provision. So implementation did come up, right? I think this is obviously at the back of everyone's mind when we are negotiating this agreement, because when you're talking about what provisions you're going to undertake, it's very important if you can envision yourself implementing them, because after all, the benefits of the agreement will only be actualized, they will only be tangible or even real when we are able to implement it. So of course, these are all the different interests that we have to balance, not just for customs duties, but also the other issues in the GSI. Yeah, I cannot say too much about incorporation at this point, because this is an issue that has to be discussed with the membership as well, with my fellow co-conveners, Australia and Japan. I think some of you are down into this call. Yeah, so yes, so this is a to be decided component. But yeah, of course, this is definitely a top of mind priority for us, because we are, as I said, trying to work towards a timely conclusion, and then also the steps after that will follow quite closely. On Harvey's presentation, thank you very much. I'm always very excited by the kind of information he brings. I have encountered that the openness data before, which I really liked, because I think even for Singapore, right? For us, we have a number of digital economy agreements, and we are very proactive in the area, right? Including on the GSI, and then also our co-conveners, Australia and Japan, who also rank very highly on that openness scale. It is very helpful for us to also kind of try and quantify how the GSI could help to first, bring about more openness, whether it's across markets or in certain sectors, certain areas, what that would look like for the membership as well. Because I must say that the work that OECD does is very valuable, because it is quite resource intensive for us to try and track and come up with these figures. So we do benefit a lot from consulting with OECD colleagues. And yes, so it is quite interesting to see that a lot of these more open countries, or countries that you already feel like, are doing a lot in this area of connectivity, openness, and then also regulations. There's still a lot of room that this can improve. I think especially when in terms of reach to other markets, because when you do a bilateral agreement, of course you get into a lot of areas that maybe don't appear in a plurilateral agreement, but at the same time, you are limited to that one partner or that 2 or 3 partners. But the value of this GSI is really also comes very much from the broad-based membership, because I would say this is the first agreement of its kind to have this many members at such a high level trying to sign on to that one agreement. And I think also mentioned previously that we want to get the best outcome for this agreement, and that includes having as many members as possible sign up, when the negotiations are completed. Well, I can't speak to the final number, right? Because I don't want to speak on behalf of the membership, and I want to give everyone that kind of space to consult comfortably and fully as part of the due processes. But at the same time, of course, we are always very hopeful that more people will continue to join. So 91 is just how many we have now, right? But we of course have a lot more other members at the WTO, and we are always open to continue to welcome these members, whether it's through, I think we do also engage non-participants at this point who are keeping track of these discussions, but might not be fully ready to engage at this juncture, because everyone has their own pace of developing digital trade rules. And sometimes it's not the most convenient, or it's not the most, the appetite is not there yet. It's not mature enough for them to join the negotiations yet. But of course, they continue to keep very close tabs. So I would say at the WTO, within the WTO space, there is a lot of interest around digital trade, even extending beyond the JSI grouping. Yes. So just very quick comments from me, but if there's anything you're specifically interested to know about, let me know.
Thank you. Well, there are some questions in the chat, which I think some of you have seen. There's a question for Javier on privacy as reflected in FTAs and whether it contributes or not to the index. There's a question for Hildegun on how to cooperate around interoperability while ensuring discretion to cover privacy and cybersecurity and all the other issues, including AI. And there's a question which I think is a good one for everybody to focus on, because just as governments are doing their final consultations, as Jabera has said, industry stakeholders are also gathering at various points in the next days, weeks, and months, and wondering what they should be doing, how they can help. I mean, Hildegun's there in Milan, where the G7's been meeting. I mean, we have the APEC Business Advisory Council meeting in Tokyo in a couple of weeks. We have industry is currently drafting ministers' messages and leaders' messages all over the world for different venues. And what are the key helpful things that stakeholders can call for? And so I'm just going to give everyone a couple of minutes. We'll start with Pascal, then Javier.
Sure, thank you. So let me maybe focus what you asked on the MSMEs, because I think it is very crucial. I think big companies can navigate themselves around the different set of rules to try to go through it. But for the small and medium companies and micro companies, it's much more complicated. That's the reason why it is very important to have an harmonized set of rules. I mean, the truth is there is not one transaction on international trade without having two computers talking to each other. And you need to have, for all of those to order something, to pay something, to have the logistic and transport around it, the shipping, etc., to have the after sale, all of that requires digital transactions. So when we talk of digital trade transaction, it is actually a lot of communication between different computers all around the world. Maybe for one package, you have dozens or 20 or more connection through digital. So that is really important. And that's the reason why companies need to have one set of rules, harmonized rules, that they know that if they respect it, is going to be reflecting and respecting the legislation that they're supposed to do. Because the worst thing for a company is if they're not sure, there is no legal certainty, legal security, they just will not do it. And so that's why we want to have the improvement of the regulations. So for us, once again, we want to have this set of rules. We want to have in it the moratorium on custom duties on electric transmissions. For us, the WTO credibility is at stake. If the WTO is going to allow countries to raise tariff on services, it means that the 25% of international trade which have been escaping tariff so far will be allowed to raise tariff because of rules into the WTO, which has been created to remove barriers, not to create new barriers. So the services sector is still very much behind the WTO rules and supporting setting up rules. But if we will be going in the wrong direction, I think the WTO credibility will be certainly at stake. And coming back to the question of the incorporation, and I fully understand your position, Gerbera, but not being willing to go into this. But as business, I mean, my mission is to tell all of those negotiators around the room and elsewhere that this is a must. You need to find a way to incorporate these new, first to finish the line, to cross the line, have the set of rules there, and then to incorporate it in a way or another into the WTO core rules. Because as you mentioned the different digital trade agreement that Singapore is running around the world. One of them is actually between the EU and the European Union, and Singapore. We have digital trade agreement, or digital agreement, rather it is said, which is very nice rules of cooperation between the government and wanted to cooperate more, etc. That's very nice. You have memorandum of understandings, you have digital trade principles, very nice, thank you very much. But what business said, and I repeat it again, is when we want rules to know what we can do and what we cannot do. That's the reason why we need international trade agreement, a treaty, which is a binding instrument, and there our companies know what they can do and not. And that, for us, that's the summary of the whole exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier.
So thank you very much for that very stimulating conversation. Maybe just want to make 3 quick points. First of all, on the number of 30% that you mentioned, I just want to highlight that this is provisional. This is work that we're doing at the moment, so I pulled it out from the current work. It might not be 30%, it might be 28%, it might be 32%, but the order of magnitude is likely to be there. And I think that the real point here is the point that Gerbera made, that really it extends this new integration into places where there was no digital integration previously, but also adds to those that have already done quite a lot. The other thing I wanted to mention was a mistake that I made earlier that was corrected by Debbie Elms, so I thank her, that I mentioned that no LDCs has a trade agreement. That's wrong. What I meant is no low-income country has a trade agreement with an FTA, and I think that's an important point. The other thing I want to highlight, which relates to the point that Nicholas was making in the Q&A, was about where new regulation falls in the OECD sort of measurement of the digital economy. We have at the moment sort of different types of measures. Our DSTRI looks at domestic regulation. Our Indigo indicator, which we're developing, looks at international discussions in these areas, and we hope to use them in different ways. So things like GDPR and privacy would fall as domestic regulation. But what I wanted to say is that maybe not focusing on the number that we gave earlier, the 30% that we gave earlier. What's really going to be important is how does that translate into more trade, into more GDP, into more jobs. And sort of the homework that we take in continuing to support the JSI discussions and all that is to try and see whether we can start measuring the impact that this might have on people and on trade. And just one last thing to point on regulatory fragmentation. We haven't done this in the context of digital, but I have to point to Hildegard's excellent paper on regulatory fragmentation using the heterogeneity on the STRI, which could be applied to the DSTRI as well. So a lot of really useful already work on regulatory fragmentation from Hildegard and its implications. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, over to Hildegard for a last word.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to address your question about the need for investment in infrastructure. If we look at international bandwidth use, and there is also a figure on the capacity utilization, and it's nowhere near 100%. So I don't think the critical issue is really the development of new networks, But what we do observe is actually a usage gap. So particularly in developing country, we see that the internet coverage is higher than the internet uptake. And what could be an important explanation for this is kind of the absence of the virtuous cycle where we have content and the supply of useful content would trigger the demand for bandwidth use or for internet subscription, which in turn would stimulate the supply of content. So I think that is an area where this GSI is really important, because it takes a holistic view of both the content and the network, and that is really useful in this development perspective. And I think there is also a skills gap here. So there was a guy at the meeting I attended in UNCTAD who said that we need to develop from being a downloading nation to an uploading nation, and I think that was a very good take on it. So yes, I think it's important to have sufficient bandwidth, and it's really important for developing countries to invest in secure networks. And there is no way that you can get away from having the sufficient privacy and security measures in place to access international markets. So that's where you really need to focus on your investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, before I summarize a few takeaways and draw this to a close, I just want to ask Jabera, would you like a last word before I summarize? I mean, it's a very critical moment in the negotiations, and we're very pleased to have you with us. And if there's something you'd like to add, we're all ears.
Okay, nothing too heavy from me, but so I think there was a question from Nicholas earlier, right? The quick answer is that the GSI would apply to the signatories first as a starting point, right? And then whoever who wishes to join. Actually, I'm very happy to see the turnout today, because I think on our part, Australia, Japan, Singapore as co-conveners, we do try and do outreach on the GSI to try and get people know, what's happening to the best, to the furthest extent we can, right, at any point in time. And of course, we would be keen to stay in contact with a lot of our industry colleagues and stakeholders who are paying attention to this closely, especially, I would say, in the coming months, right, when we are trying to drum up a little bit more publicity for the GSI where it will be. So definitely, whoever is keen to keep in contact and keep tabs on this, let me know. Then we will keep you posted as well where we can. And if you have any questions, you can also send them my way. I think I've covered most of what I can share today. But yes, keep your eyes on the GSI in the coming months. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being so prepared to share with us. And I can promise you we'll all be in touch with lots of questions and lots of interest for you. So let me just quickly try and pull this together. I think it's been pretty clear that industry everywhere is very strongly supportive of the WTO JSI on e-commerce negotiations, and in a way like no other issue on the WTO table, this is the one that has brought industry representatives back to Geneva and back to the WTO. And the simple reason is that we do need the WTO's rulebook to be updated to meet the enormous promise out there of productivity and growth and development from an evolving digital economy. So I think to be a bit more precise, industry actually sees real commercial value in this deal. So what's in it for the business community? Everything's been mentioned. First, digital trade facilitation, all the issues Jabera and Pascal both mentioned to do with electronic payment services, electronic authentication, e-signatures, e-contracts, e-invoicing, all of those things that make it easier to trade online. Provisions on open internet access. This is the big democratizing of access to technology and open government data, the sharing of government data, the incredible opportunities this is giving to everyone, all citizens. And the beginning, the very first ever WTO provisions on personal data protection, cybersecurity, consumer protection that help promote trust in the digital economy. And very importantly, a lasting solution to prohibit customs duties on electronic transmissions. This is a fundamental commercial value to all industry across the goods and services sector as we increasingly go online. What else is in it? Digital regulatory cooperation, and we've talked about that binding constraint from regulatory fragmentation. The beginning of greater cooperation on digital standards, a review in a couple of years, in 2 years, on how to go the next step and include issues such as cross-border data flows, data localization, source code, cryptography, all the issues that haven't been able to be handled in what is a global baseline framework, but from which we can build. And industry is very keen to get on with that building process, therefore very keen to have the global benchmark framework in place. And I have to echo Pascal in making that point quite strongly. So I think in a nutshell, you know, an outcome on this particular deal on e-commerce really will be the defining 21st century moment for the multilateral trading system. We're already a quarter of the way through that century. Surely it's time now. Now, we're already quarter of the way through. Things are changing very rapidly, and the WTO will only keep up if we can start with this. So I just want to wish all the negotiators good luck, and I'm grateful because I can see some of you are there in the audience keeping tabs on Jabera and but also I hope keeping tabs on stakeholder views around the table, because we have really felt that it was important that you be reminded of the empirical evidence base and also the industry perspective on this. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to the Council on Economic Policies for providing this opportunity, and good luck for the rest of the week.